Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. I want to talk about one of my favorite pieces of structure, especially during the cold water period from now until like your spawning period. Shell beds are going to be one of the best areas to fish. Oftentimes, they're very much underfished by anglers on the water, and therefore, when you do find one that's actively being used as a feeding location, it can be a phenomenal place to fish, and those fish are not nearly as pressured as a lot of other areas. The problem with shell beds is they can be difficult to locate. If you don't know what you're looking for, you really have no idea what they even show up as in terms of your graph. You don't know where to find them, and they're not that easy to locate. But when you know what to look for, they are not that difficult to find. With a little bit of practice, you can do it. So what I want to do today is kind of walk you through what the shell beds are, why they're good, how to find them, what you're looking for, and the baits that I like to use on them, because they truly can be phenomenal places to fish, especially during this time of year. You know, like I said, during the cooler water periods, a lot of your fish are more offshore, which is where a lot of your shell beds are going to be. And they're more just waiting for the bait fish and the fish to come to them versus them aggressively leaving and roaming around. So when you find an active shell bed, can be a very good place to fish. Before I get into the details of the shell bed, I do want to remind you if you're looking for a little bit of help on your local lakes, check out the lake breakdowns that I do. We do 40 waypoints. It's generally 8 different patterns for a specific time of the year. It's a great way to get some help on a lake in your area, or maybe you're taking a vacation to a specific lake and you just want a little bit of guidance. These are all waypoints that I've picked out myself, and a lot of them are waypoints that I fish in the tournaments when I hit these lakes. So check those out. Also, if you want to support the channel and you're looking to purchase some tackle, please use my Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. That's in the description of the video as well, and it's a great way to support the channel and very, very much appreciated. All right, so let's talk a little bit about shell beds. Why are shell beds so good? Well, they're good for a couple of reasons. One, generally speaking, they provide hard bottom areas because you have groups of shells in an area, but more than anything, the shells are in the location that they're at because you have good current flow. That could be wind driven current, or it could be natural current where maybe you have a stream that comes into a lake or something along those lines. But the reason the shells are stacked up in those areas is because they are filter feeders. So they need good water flow in those areas. So when you find a shell bed, generally speaking, you've got an area that has current flow, natural or wind driven. A lot of times those shell beds are going to be located already in harder bottom areas. So you're going to be looking on your maps for areas where you've got steeper break lines. They're generally going to be at the top of that break or on that break, because as you have current that hits that steep break line, the current gets confined, comes up over the break line. Therefore, there's more water flow for the shells to filter. The other area you find them most of the time is where you've got current coming into an area. So maybe you've got a lake that's got a stream coming in where that stream enters the lake. A lot of times you get a good shell bed right there. If you're talking about down in Florida, a lot of those lakes are connected by canals. Anywhere that canal flows in or out of one lake into another lake is generally a place where you have shell beds. They're just in areas where you have good current flow. So those are the two main areas to find them. You can randomly run into them just going down a shoreline, but generally speaking, if you looked at a map, you could kind of pick out areas, high percentage areas to find the shell beds. So if you've located a shell bed, one of the positives about that is because the shells are in that area because they're filtering out the water, that indicates there's a lot of nutrients in that area. So if you have a lot of nutrients, that draws a lot of the bait fish that are feeding on phytoplankton and small things in the water, and therefore that draws the bass to that area as well. So not only do you have a hard bottom area, which the bass tend to like, you've got an area that has a lot of bait fish, and at the same time, a lot of times these areas provide really good feeding locations because the shell bed creates an open area. So in some instances, you may have grass that grows around the shell bed. And what that means is there's a good ambush location. The bass can sit on the side of the grass, wait for something to come into the clearing that's above the shell bed, and therefore they can jump on ambush that bait fish. So the point being, they're good locations to feed because there's a whole bunch of life and activity going on in that area because of the current flow through it. So it's not just simply like having a brush pile out in the middle of nowhere. There's a bunch of things that are coming together to make that shell bed good. Now, some shell beds are only the size of a garbage can lid, and some shell beds might be hundreds of yards long, depending on what the area sets up as. So they vary very much in size, but it's just one of those things that once you've located them, you know there's going to be fish that are around in those areas for the most part. Now, not every shell bed is good, but generally speaking, every shell bed can be good at certain times. It's just a matter of whether or not the fish are using it. But when you find an active one, generally speaking, you can catch a couple. It might go dead. You leave, come back in an hour or two, and you can catch a couple more, and you can do that all day. So if you have three, four, or five different shell beds, you can rotate them and catch fish every time you stop at one, which is a great way to generate strikes. So I want to go over a couple of the baits that I love for fishing shell beds. They are a little bit different. It just seem like there are some baits that produce much better for me. So I'm going to give you the exact bait in the exact color that I like to use. Now, these baits, I've had great success anywhere from the Mississippi River all the way down to Florida and lakes in between on shell beds. These are my go-to shell bed baits. Some of them I don't necessarily have a reasoning. I don't think any of them are going to be huge surprises in terms of baits, but I want to give you the specific colors to concentrate on too, because they're the most successful ones for me when I'm fishing shell beds. So the first bait I'm going to talk about is a 6-inch Bastric paddle tail swim bait. This is the AU color. The AU color seems to be one of the more consistent colors out there, but this bait has done wonders for me fishing shell beds, like I just said, everywhere from the Mississippi River all the way down to Florida. It catches big ones. I like to fish it on a heavier head and keep it really close to the bottom. Now, in most of these cases, these baits are all bottom contact baits. The swim bait seems to be a bait that can generate some of those bigger strikes. I've had instances fishing shell beds down in Florida where I'm catching a lot of fish on some of these other baits, but I'm not catching the biggest fish that are there. I pull out the 6-inch Bass Tricks AU swim bait, throw it up through there, and I'll generate a couple of bigger bites, those 4 to 6 pounders. So it's one of those things that I feel like the rest of the baits are bottom contact baits. This bait I still like to keep down closer to the bottom. So if I'm fishing, let's say an 8 to 10 foot, which is where a lot of shell beds are, I'll probably have it on a 1/2 ounce head, nice slow retrieve through the shell beds, bouncing off the bottom occasionally, and it generates those bigger strikes for me. Now, when I'm talking about a bottom bait, one of my favorites, this is the Mac Scent, the Berkley Mac Scent Magnum Hitworm. This is the plum apple color. The plum apple is just great anytime you're talking about using a bigger shaky head, and that's what I fish this on. One of the keys to fishing a shaky head on the shell bars is you maintain bottom contact, and therefore you feel the bait coming through the shell. Like I said, in some of these instances, the shell beds are maybe only the size of a truck, and from that standpoint, you need to know when you're in the shell bed. You know, you'll hear a lot of people talk about fishing shells, and they're like, "Man, I threw it out there, I'm dragging, and then I felt the shells. Like I felt the stickiness." Because when you're dragging through the shells, it's not necessarily like hitting rocks. It's more like you feel the hard bottom, and it's almost like your bait is sticking to the bottom. And that's just because it's grabbing in between every little shell. So a shaky head is a really good way to maintain that bottom contact and feel the bottom. And the Magnum Hitworm in the plum apple color is one of the best baits that I found for fishing through shell beds. It just generates great strikes. The next one that I've got here is the Magnum Zoom Ultra Vibe Speedworm. This is the red bug color. This bait has done me really good. I caught, a few years ago fishing shell beds on the Harris Chain of Lakes down in Florida. I finished fifth overall and caught a pile of my fish on the red bug Magnum speedworm that you can see here. Just a great bait. And I fished this uh, in a couple of different ways. One of the best ways is to fish it on a Carolina rig. And the reason for that is, again, you want to be able to feel the bottom. You need to know when you're in the shells, because most of the time, if you're not hitting that shells, if you're not feeling that stickiness of your weight on the bottom, you're probably not in the strike zone. So it's really important to be able to feel when you're in them and when you're not. And when you're in them, you can slow down, you start to expect the bite. You know you're in the strike zone versus, if you're not feeling the bottom, you don't necessarily know if you're where you need to be. But I love to fish it. I will fish it occasionally on an unpegged Texas rig if there's more grass around. Uh, and that's one of the ways I was catching a lot of fish as well in that Harris Chain event. That just turned out to be a lot of the areas I was fishing were really small and they were surrounded by grass. So it was important to fish it on a Texas rig. But in most cases, if I can fish this guy on a Carolina rig, I will tend to do that. Next up, and again, if you go back and watch that Harris chain video, you see I caught a bunch of fish as well on a lipless, and this was one of the lipless I was throwing. This is the Berkley Halfounce War Pig. This is just the black and gold color. One of my favorites. I will throw this out on the shell beds and I will yo-yo it through the shell bed and bring it back to the boat. It's a great way to generate strikes from fish that are just in a lethargic mode. So if you know there's fish there and they're not biting the worms that you're dragging through there, I really like to yo-yo a trap style bait, a lipless crankbait like this guy, through that area because it generates strikes. It gets reaction strikes. And it's one of those baits. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've fished the shell bed, dragged some baits through there, didn't get bit, end up taking one or two casts with this guy and end up firing up the school and I'll catch like 4 or 5 in a row. That just seems how it happens. I love the black gold color. It just seems to work great on the shell beds and I've had a ton of success on that bait. But having something that can generate reaction strikes is really important as well. Because in some instances, if you do find a shell bed that is more of a community shell bed, which happens a lot, those fish are very accustomed to seeing worms get dragged through their area, and having a reaction bait is huge to generating strikes. The last one that I've had really good success with here, this is a Strike King 5XD. This is an olive shad color. It's a fantastic crankbait. It runs down into that, I'll say consistently down to that like that 12-foot range, which again, if you're fishing a shell bed that's an 8-10 foot of water, having a crankbait that runs down into 12-foot range is very good. But the olive shad color is a phenomenal one for me. I've had a ton of really good success on that. But a crankbait, again, similar to a lipless crankbait, is a good way to generate some of those bigger strikes from fish that are maybe more pressured on the shell bed or just in a lethargic mode. And you can bring that down there and ricochet it off the shells and dig into the shells and stir up a mess, which a lot of times just draws attention to the area. If there's bait fish down there and you're stirring up the shells, the bait fish start feeding and that kind of gets the bass feeding. It's just one of those cycles that it's important to recognize that in some instances, some of these baits are more about just bringing the area to life again. Like I said, if you're bringing a crankbait through that area, stirring up the bottom, it can start the whole food chain off. And when that happens, maybe you're not going to get as many, that many bites on the crankbait, but when you pick up a worm or the swim bait and bring it through there, you'll generate strikes at that point because now the bass are watching the minnows and the shad get active. It just starts everything off. So it's really important to recognize when fishing shell beds that these baits all work phenomenally well. But generally speaking, don't just throw one bait on a shell bed and then leave. Throw it, I would say throw at least one reaction style bait and one finesse style bait or smaller worm dragging style bait. And in that case, you're going to really work that area a little bit more thorough. But it never ceases to amaze me with shell beds how often I get nothing on one bait, pick up one of these other baits, and then it's like you trigger them, you get 4 or 5 fish on 4 or 5 casts in a row, and then you can come back and trigger them again, maybe on the bait that didn't work the first time around. But these are my favorites for shell beds. Guys, go out, find yourself some shell beds. They can be fish producing places this time of year, and just one of my favorite places to fish if you can find them. So hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new tip for you tomorrow.